11. Breaking the code. Really, in a lot of ways, Mr. Flannery is his own worst enemy. Federal Magistrate Judge Stephen Whalen. A few years before Meech and Terry were arrested, their chief financial officer, the preppy and charismatic Doc Marshall, ran into DEA agent Jack Harvey at the Atlanta airport. Doc was traveling on BMF-related business, weaving through the world's busiest terminal when the slender, soft-spoken agent approached him. Harvey had a question for the CFO, one that had been a long time coming. Starting in the late 90s, Harvey had begun fielding rumors about Big Meech, and he'd spend the next 5 years shadowing various members of BMF. Through confidential sources, Harvey heard about Meech's alleged ruthlessness as a cocaine kingpin and his supposed role in the highway shooting of a federal informant. Years later, Harvey staked out the sprawling White House, watching as the iron gate at the foot of the road admitted select guests to Meech's 35th birthday party. Within a few months, Harvey found a way inside the house. As part of a law enforcement team armed with a search warrant for the weapon used in a shootout behind Club Chaos. The search didn't turn up the gun, but it did yield documents that linked the Flannery brothers to a company called Exquisite Empire and to its owner, William Doc Marshall. Doc was under investigation at the time by another member of the White House search team, Atlanta police detective Bryant Bubba Burns. For nearly a year, Burns had been working undercover to infiltrate a white-collar crime ring that Doc oversaw. By posing as a would-be straw borrower, Burns determined that Doc's brokerage firm, Exquisite, was getting loans for high-end cars and homes in the names of willing participants, such as himself, and then passing them along to drug dealers. In the midst of the undercover sting, and 2 months before the White House search, Burns' investigation got an unexpected boost. Doc Marshall shot and killed a home intruder inside a posh townhouse. When Burns searched the house, he found a pile of documents that listed Exquisite's roster of workers and its illegal deals. Investigators also discovered a room-sized safe that held a single kilo of cocaine. Once Burns and Harvey linked the documents in Doc's townhouse to others discovered in the White House, the two investigators concluded that Doc was closely tied to the Flannery brothers. In fact, Burns and Harvey believed that Doc had been guarding a BMF stash house. From that point on, Doc became a highly desirable target. Judging from the paperwork in the White House, he was integral to the Flannery's organization, and though he hadn't been charged in the incident at the townhouse, the shooting of the armed intruders appeared to be self-defense, investigators could still dangle the threat of a few major felonies over his head. The kilo in the safe and the mortgage fraud ring were plenty incriminating, but investigators wanted more. When Harvey caught up with Doc at the airport that day, he had a good idea how high his target ranked in the Black Mafia family. Harvey also believed that the well-dressed, deep-voiced businessman might be open to negotiating. He pulled Doc aside and said he wanted to show him some pictures. He wanted to know what he might be willing to say about a few members of the Black Mafia family. Doc's reply was succinct. "I'm not saying anything." But if he were to say something, Doc asked, would his cooperation prevent him from being charged with a crime? "No," Harvey answered. "Am I going to be arrested?" "Yes." "Well," Doc said, issuing a not-so-subtle challenge, "let's get it going." In the years since the encounter in the airport, Doc became more intertwined with BMF. He also was one of the few associates who maintained close contact with both Flannery brothers after they split, a factor that would make him an invaluable witness. Though Doc had begun to align himself more tightly with Meech's crew, he continued to do the books for the two separate sides of the organization. As CFO, he kept track of all the income, debts, and expenses for both Meech's and Terry's crews. Through Exquisite, he obtained cars, homes, and jewels for the brothers. He set up a fake travel company so that he could procure airline tickets for BMF members. He even created fake W-2s for the agency's fictitious employees so that BMF members could show legitimate income. Doc also began to traffic BMF's cocaine. He sometimes picked up kilo-stuffed duffel bags from Terry at the White House in Atlanta, where he witnessed the boss in the presence of 100 bricks at a time. Though Doc couldn't say the same of Meech didn't handle his cocaine shipments personally, J-Bo did. Doc paid plenty of visits to Meech's Atlanta stash houses too, the Gate, the Elevator, and Space Mountain. Doc also tagged along with Meech and his entourage when they descended on the city's clubs. In fact, Doc had been hanging out with the crew the night a few of its members got into a deadly fight behind the Velvet Room. Doc hadn't been indicted along with the Flannery brothers, but he was named in a related federal indictment file under seal the same day in Orlando. The indictment charged 8 defendants with helping BMF obtain luxury cars outfitted with secret traps for hauling cash and cocaine. And it described Doc as both the leader of the car ring and BMF's chief financial officer. 8 days after the indictment was filed, on October 28, 2005, Doc was heading home to Atlanta from a meeting in Miami with Slim, Terry's right-hand man. Terry required that Doc and Slim meet once a month in person because the fiscal reports Doc prepared couldn't be discussed over the phone. Before Doc made it to his house, he was surrounded by a federal task force. Agents arrested him, and the indictment against him was unsealed. The feds hinted that more charges would be coming, and they immediately began to discuss with him the benefits of cooperating with the government. To investigators, the difficulty of any BMF probe boiled down to the crew's strict code of silence. Crew members lived by it, and they often pressed the importance of the code upon outsiders who'd witnessed their crimes. The silence was infectious. It was common for police to begin interviewing witnesses, only to find that once the witnesses learned the identity of the suspects, they go south. That had been the problem in the Chaos investigation, after Sean P. Diddy Combs' former bodyguard, Wolf Jones, and Wolf's childhood friend, Riz Gertie, were killed. The same issue plagued the investigation of the Velvet Room incident, during which Rashonable Prince Drummond was severely beaten and then shot to death. The attack at P. Diddy's Atlanta restaurant, Justin's, was no different. 2 nephews of R&B superstar Bobby Brown were brutally stabbed, and Brown's family quickly clammed up. But once a potential witness is under indictment, convincing them to talk gets easier. That's because the authorities have a powerful bargaining chip, the possibility of a shorter prison sentence. Defendants who cooperate typically get 20% of their sentence shaved off, sometimes more. If a defendant decides to assist the government, the information he shares often leads to more indictments and additional defendants, which means a larger pool of potential witnesses from which to draw. That was the government's strategy in its case against the Flannery brothers. And by the time the brothers were arrested, the feds had leads on several insiders who they thought could help build their case. One potential witness on Meech's side seemed particularly promising. 3 months before the Flannery's indictment and minutes before his cocaine trafficking trial was set to begin, Omari O-Dog McCree surprised a number of people, including Rand Shahey, the assistant district attorney, working his case, and decided to plead guilty. For Shahey, the plea was the end of an exhausting wiretap investigation in which he and a handful of Atlanta's best law enforcement officers, including his close friend Detective Burns, had come within a breath of getting a wire up on Meech's phone. With Omari's guilty plea, that local investigation into BMF was nearing its conclusion. The feds had taken over the broader investigation, and Shahey wasn't entirely happy about it. He felt that the Atlanta-based officers were the real heart of the BMF investigation. His disenchantment over the case led to him leaving the DA's office for private practice, but not before Omari was sentenced to 15 years in state prison. Following the sentencing, the feds swooped into the DA's office to pull Omari's file. Omari already had given a statement that implicated Meech. Now the feds were hoping he'd be willing to make the same claim on the witness stand. In the statement, which Omari delivered to Detective Burns and a fellow investigator, he laid out in no uncertain terms that he was part of Big Meech's cocaine ring. He said he regularly picked up kilos from Meech's right-hand man J-Bo at 2 locations, the gate and the elevator. But at that point in the interview, he got spooked. He refused to say anything else, and he soon would try to distance himself from what he did say. Omari didn't want to be known as a snitch. His attorney worked, unsuccessfully, to have the statement stricken from the court record. But even though the document was ruled fair game, Omari was hesitant to cooperate further. For that and other reasons, the case against Meech wasn't shaping up as well as prosecutors had hoped. As for Terry's side of the organization, at least one high-ranking crew member quickly turned. In November 2005, Terry's trusted Detroit manager, Arnold A.R. Boyd, was the first to flip. AR had grown up a block away from the Flannery brothers in southwest Detroit and got his start in the organization as Terry's personal driver. He later assumed the top post in Detroit after his older brother, Benjamin Blank Johnson, who'd been part of the Flannery's drug ring since it operated out of their childhood home on Edsel Street, was busted with a kilo of coke. AR was part of Terry's innermost circle. He'd been exposed to many of the most intimate details of Terry's side of the organization, and he was extremely familiar with the boss's manipulative managerial style. It appeared to have left AR somewhat bitter. He didn't need much time to decide what he should do. He made a deal with the feds a month after he, the Flannery brothers, and 20 of their associates were indicted. For his cooperation, he'd have 4 years shaved off his 8 to 12-year sentence. AR gave the feds a rundown of how he helped Terry shuttle cash and cocaine across the country in the secret compartments of BMF's vans and limos. He illustrated how the kilos were processed in the Detroit lab. He described how Terry circumvented the IRS to buy millions of dollars in diamonds from Jacob the jeweler Arabo. He mentioned how, during a trip to Atlanta, he visited the White House and saw Terry and his top-ranking associates, Slim Bivens, Chip Tooth Pegues, Lil Dog Welch, and Texas Cuz Short, hanging out in the basement where stacks and stacks of kilos were secreted. He described how, during another White House visit, he'd helped Terry load $250,000 in drug money into the vehicle of Terry's business partner, Tremaine Kiki Graham. The money, AR said, was an investment in Kiki's high-end car dealership, 404 Motorsports. Basically, AR had a lot to say about Terry, but he hardly had anything to say about Meech. Because he'd been on Terry's side of the organization, AR's knowledge of Meech's business was minimal. He was familiar with the basics, that Meech ran the rap label, BMF Entertainment, that he oversaw the organization's Atlanta headquarters, that J-Bo was his second in command, and that his close friend, the rapper Blue Da Vinci, had helped out in his cocaine ring. But AR didn't have any first-hand knowledge of those things. As with the majority of witnesses to come, AR had plenty of info to share about the quieter, more reserved Flannery brother, and hardly a thing to say about the flashier, more flamboyant one. On January 4, 2006, DEA Special Agent Bob Bell stood before a federal magistrate in Detroit and laid out the government's case so far against Demetrius Big Meech Flannery. Prosecutors were trying to convince the judge that Meech was a flight risk and a danger to the community, and therefore should be locked up without bond. To ensure that Meech remained behind bars, they'd have to show there was sufficient amount of evidence against him. And so the testimony of Agent Bell, who worked out of the DEA Detroit office and swapped information with Agent Harvey out of Atlanta, was crucial. Bell told the judge that the DEA had interviewed more than 25 witnesses in the multi-state investigation into the Black Mafia family, and 10 of them, he claimed, could link Big Meech to the drug trade. Drew Findling, the Atlanta lawyer who'd represented Meech for several years, he helped Meech avoid indictment after he was charged with the Chaos double homicide, wasn't buying it. He drilled into Bell. Findling wanted to know who these 10 witnesses were and what they'd said. Is there anybody you've interviewed that says they've sat down with Demetrius Flannery and discussed the sale and distribution of cocaine? He asked. Well, I don't know if they said it just like that, Agent Bell replied, but one witness comes to mind who says that he or she distributed multiple kilograms of cocaine for Demetrius Flannery. And there's another witness who says that he or she witnessed cocaine being handed back and forth between Demetrius Flannery and others. Bell didn't name those witnesses, though. When the judge asked if their identities needed to be kept secret for safety reasons, Bell said they did. Moving on from the subject of confidential witnesses, Bell's testimony switched gears. He was questioned about Meech's lifestyle, and on that topic, there was no shortage of detail. The DEA, both Bell in Detroit and Harvey in Atlanta, had conducted an exhaustive inventory of Meech's excess. Bell began by describing the biggest, most brazen of Meech's displays. There are billboards up in the Atlanta, Georgia area with Demetrius Flannery's and other folks' photos on them, advertising BMF Entertainment, he said. He then gave an account of Meech's 36th birthday bash a year earlier. An entire Atlanta mega club was rented out, half-naked models were hired, and $100,000 in exotic animals were bought in. Then there were the videos that Meech had commissioned in an attempt to draw the attention of big-time record execs. I'm aware of a DVD in which Demetrius Flannery says he was signing one artist and going to put large volumes of money behind him, Bell testified. It was during the time frame when Demetrius Flannery was on house arrest in Atlanta area for double homicide. Did Demetrius Flannery indicate that his organization, BMF Entertainment, was putting all their money behind Blue Da Vinci? Assistant U.S. Attorney Don Eisen asked. Yes, Bell said. And did he mention a specific amount that they were putting behind this one artist? He at one point mentioned $500,000. At another point, he mentioned $1 million. Toward the end of the 3-hour bond hearing, Eisen told the judge that Meech had all the markings of a big-time drug trafficker. She claimed he hadn't filed taxes in years and had no verifiable income. She cited as many as 10 aliases, many of them with corresponding fake driver's licenses. She said he certainly partied like a kingpin. She pointed out that his brother, Terry, in a wiretap phone conversation, complained that Meech's lifestyle was spiraling out of control. And though Meech hadn't been caught with cocaine in hand, Eisen said that the sheer quantity of kilos the organization was believed to have trafficked should be incentive enough to deny bond. Based on the amount of drugs involved, Eisen said, this is probably the highest volume drug conspiracy in this district ever. Findling was quick to admit that his client very well might be guilty of decadence. He also pointed out that decadence is not a crime. What strikes me not only about this indictment, Your Honor, but about the testimony today, is we essentially heard that Demetrius Flannery lives a flamboyant lifestyle, Findling said. There is no specific reference in the testimony to Demetrius Flannery participating in a singular act of the distribution of cocaine. It's just the aura of Demetrius Flannery. It's the aura of homes, the aura of cars, the aura of money, the aura of rap. Magistrate Judge Stephen Whalen quickly hinted that he might be willing to grant Meech bond, in part because Meech's ego seemed too big for him to escape. Really, in a lot of ways, Mr. Flannery is his own worst enemy, Whalen said from the bench. The magazine articles, the billboards, the big mouth, the lavish lifestyle. The positive side of this is he's an individual who does have a high profile. And in a perverse kind of way, that works to his benefit in terms of assuring that he's going to appear. Whalen said Meech's ostentatious behavior, though not illegal in and of itself, was somewhat incriminating. He also said that, compared with the case against his brother, who'd been denied bond at a hearing a few weeks earlier, the case against Meech seemed more weak. There's a lot of evidence that he's sort of around this organization, the judge said. His brother certainly is portrayed as a leader of this organization, but as far as what he actually did, that remains pretty ambiguous to me. And although there's probable cause, I don't think there's necessarily overwhelming evidence based on what I've heard today. And that's all I have to rule on, what I've heard today. Over the outcry of the prosecutor, Judge Whalen ruled to release Meech on $100,000 unsecured bond, meaning there be no assets such as home offered as collateral in the event he fled. Meech would be required to wear an ankle monitor, the judge said, and to live under house arrest with his mother in Detroit. A month later, another judge ruled to allow bond for Terry, even after the court's initial determination that he was too great a flight risk. Terry was ordered to pay his $150,000 bond up front, and he was to be released to the custody of his father. The prosecution launched a vigorous battle against the rulings to allow the Flannery brothers to walk. In Terry's case, the U.S. Attorney's Office claimed the defendant could easily skip out on his bond. He likely had cash secreted away that far exceeded the $150,000 bond. To Terry, the bond money could be viewed as the price of freedom, a ticket he could easily afford. BMF members are known to be hiding in Mexico or have been intercepted talking about fleeing to Mexico, Prosecutor Eisen wrote in paperwork she filed to reverse Terry's bond. Terry Flannery, Eisen claimed, has the ability to become a real international fugitive. Terry's wealth was far more tangible than Meech's. Terry had been caught on a wiretap talking about his recent purchase of a $195,000 Bentley. The feds were able to prove that he lived in a $3 million house on LA's Mulholland Drive. He'd been pulled over in Illinois with $5 million in jewelry. And at the house in St. Louis, where he'd been arrested, agents found $600,000 in cash. Within a month, before either brother was allowed to post bond, a different judge reversed the earlier rulings. Neither Meech nor Terry would be allowed to leave jail after all. The court proceedings would progress slowly, with both brothers forced to spend years in separate county lockups, and the stakes in the case were about to get higher. Doc Marshall knew what he'd be looking at if he were convicted: 20 years. Even if he were to plead guilty and spare the feds the trouble of a trial, an act that likely would be rewarded with the dismissal of a charge or two and a low-end sentence on the charges that remained, he'd still be locked up for well over a decade. His situation was grim, but he did have options. He also had one of the best lawyers in Atlanta. Doc's attorney, Steve Sato, had helped Baltimore Raven Ray Lewis beat a highly publicized murder rap stemming from a Super Bowl 2000 after-party. Years later, Sato would be part of a legal dream team that snared a mere year-long sentence for hip-hop superstar T.I., who faced a decade in prison on federal machine gun charges. Sato arguably was the best defense attorney money could buy. Yet in the end, there wasn't much the lawyer could offer Doc. The CFO already had made up his mind. He was going to cooperate, and for that, Doc didn't need a high-priced attorney. When Sato negotiated the plea deal, he gave Doc the only advice he'd need: tell the truth. Doc first met the feds on March 7, 2006, less than 2 months after Meech's bond hearing. Over the course of the year, he laid out the details of his involvement with no less than 70 of BMF's major players. He also confessed to how much coke he'd moved himself. The numbers startled his interrogators, including Agent Harvey and Detective Burns. They knew Doc to be the money man, a number cruncher. But they didn't realize he was a major drug distributor too. Not until he told them that he moved nearly 2,000 kilos in 3 years did they come to realize how significant Doc truly was. Doc described how in late 2003 and early 2004, he'd go to the White House once a week to grab 10 kilos or more. By then, he said, Terry had wrenched control of the house from Meech. Meech had nothing to do with the mansion anymore. During most of Doc's visits, he picked up his shipment from one of Terry's top managers, Michael Freak Green. On other occasions, he'd get the coke from Slim, Texas Cuz, or Terry himself. Doc also met regularly with Terry, both at the White House and elsewhere, to advise him on his finances. Terry wanted to move his drug money into his girlfriend's bank accounts, since she had a company set up for her by Terry in her name. Doc helped Terry funnel the cash to her in such a way that avoided federal detection. He also helped Terry find legitimate investments in which he could safely sink his drug money. Any company that made a profit would suffice. At one point, Doc even laundered Terry's drug money through a daycare. Doc conducted business separately with Meech. As with Terry, he prepared spreadsheets for Meech that itemized his spending. In any given month, there were tens of thousands of dollars in first-class airline tickets for his crew, a similar amount to cover the car notes on the Maybachs, Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and Porsches that he and his associates drove, and a seemingly exorbitant $50,000 to cover a month's rent at a Miami mansion, which actually amounted to less than putting up crew members in individual hotel rooms. Doc also described what went on in Meech's stash houses. At the gate, a handsome traditional home that sat well off the road in a wooded residential part of Buckhead, kilos of cocaine were stuffed into duffel bags and passed out in the common room, in plain view of the pool table where BMF's customers congregated. Doc said the house held 200 or so kilos every 10 days, until Meech, worried that the feds were close at hand, ordered that the operation be moved to Space Mountain. Doc never knew Meech to set foot inside the gate. The boss was too careful to get that close to his shipment. Yet Doc did visit with Meech at the brick townhouse where he lived, the elevator. Doc helped Meech procure the home in the name of a straw purchaser. The elevator was considered a safe, insulated place. Meech held regular meetings there for his most trusted crew members, and Doc was in a better position than most to describe to the feds, with authority, the rank of Meech's crew, most of whom hadn't yet been charged. Doc told the feds that Chad Jabo Brown was right under Meech, followed by Meech's top-level managers Fleming Ill Daniels and Martez Tito Berth. He also said that Meech's drug associates included the rapper Blue Da Vinci. In all, Doc identified more than a dozen BMF members who hadn't yet been indicted, but soon would be. In the years to come, he'd take the stand in front of juries and grand juries in Detroit, Orlando, Nashville, and Greenville. Doc was polite and confident on the stand, and nothing he said was discredited. As a result, he was sentenced to only 8 years in prison. Even after his sentencing, he continued to offer information to the government, and to find himself on the receiving end of threats, including a razor blade slipped into his plate of jail food. Doc's first testimony was in front of a federal grand jury in Detroit. Terry's high-ranking associate, A.R., testified too. The grand jury had been called in the spring of 2006 to decide whether more charges should be filed against the Flinnerys, and whether evidence of several specific drug deals should be added to the indictment. The grand jurors agreed that the charges and evidence had merit. Due in part to Doc and A.R.'s testimony, Meech and Terry faced a few extra counts of cocaine distribution, and the indictment was enhanced with a lengthy description of the hundreds of kilos the brothers allegedly trafficked on specific occasions. The new allegations seemed minor compared with the charges the brothers already were facing, but there was one catch. Due to the amount of cocaine now alleged to have been trafficked by BMF, the case surpassed an important milestone in federal law. The sheer volume of drugs was enough to increase Meech and Terry's mandatory prison sentence. If convicted, they'd no longer have the option to get the minimum 20 years. If convicted, they'd be sent to prison for life. And in the federal system, there's no parole. Of all the information Doc fed investigators, there was one area in which his assistance would be of little use: the aftermath of the gruesome fight at Sean P. Diddy Combs' Atlanta restaurant, Justin's. During the brawl, Bobby Brown's nephews were stabbed, and BMF member Mark Baby Blue Dixon was arrested on aggravated assault charges. Yet Fulton County prosecutors were having a hard time getting the witnesses, including Brown's family, to cooperate. Though a few of them provided statements shortly after the incident, they later backed away from what they said. Prosecutors then dropped the case against the other man allegedly involved in the attack, a 6'7", 350-pound member of Baby Blue's entourage named Cleveland Hall. The DA's office believed that without the cooperation of the victims and witnesses, Hall's charges wouldn't stand, but prosecutors were still plowing ahead with the case against Baby Blue. As Doc would later explain to Harvey, the hush fell over the witnesses for a reason. Doc told the federal agent that a message from BMF's top brass had quieted the Browns. Apparently, Meech had gotten through to them. J-Bo told me that Meech contacted their family members and said, "Well, let's just squash this thing," Doc recalled to Harvey. "We are prepared to take this to another level." Baby Blue initially was denied bond on his aggravated assault charges. Detective Burns, who testified at the bond hearing, tried to ensure that he stayed locked up. But in the fall of 2005, Baby Blue's attorney convinced the judge to release him pending trial. Had the attorney failed, Baby Blue's life might have been spared. Doc was friendly with Baby Blue, a young, handsome, and heavily tattooed member of BMF. He passed himself off as Blue Da Vinci's younger brother, and though the two weren't actually related, they did have a few things in common. They both had relocated from Southern California to Atlanta. They both had matching tattoos on their forearms bearing BMF's motto, "Death Before Dishonor." And both were highly visible members of Meech's entourage. Blue Da Vinci, because of his songs, along with Jeezy's, were BMF's club anthems, and Baby Blue because he was a perfect specimen for the spotlight. He had a slender, muscular build and the perfectly chiseled features of a statue. After Baby Blue was released on a $50,000 bond, he immediately went to visit Doc. He said he didn't feel like he should have to go down for the stabbings. He said he intended to beat the charge. He just graduated from Talladega College in Alabama. At age 27, he said it wasn't too late for him to turn this mess around. The following spring, 2 days after Doc had his first debriefing with the feds, Baby Blue and his girlfriend were hanging out at a Buckhead club called The Living Room when he ran into his ex-girlfriend. The two women got into a fight, after which Baby Blue asked his ex to meet him in a nearby parking lot. At the lot, they got into a screaming match. His current girlfriend stayed in the car. His ex called her friends for backup. Within minutes, they pulled up in a black BMW. Baby Blue told the driver that he'd kill him if he didn't back off. Moments later, Baby Blue approached the driver's side window. For once, he didn't have the protection of the foreboding entourage to which he'd grown so accustomed. This time, he was on his own. When Baby Blue pulled on the door handle, the driver panicked. He pulled a gun, fired twice, and peeled out of the parking lot. With his girlfriend standing by helplessly, Baby Blue collapsed on the pavement. He was dead by the time police arrived, and the investigation into the brutal stabbings at Justin's was closed. Later that month, federal agents in Greenville, South Carolina, reached what they thought was the end of a 2-year investigation into Tremaine Kiki Graham. A year had passed since a bounty hunter and a team of U.S. Marshals surrounded the unsuspecting fugitive outside a Subway sandwich shop in suburban Los Angeles. For months after, Kiki held his tongue. But on March 27, 2006, his change of heart arrived. A week before he and his boss, J. Rock Davis, were scheduled for trial on cocaine conspiracy charges. The last time Kiki was about to face a jury, back in November 2004, he cut his ankle monitor and fled across the country. This time, though, he decided to take what seemed to be a less resistant route. Kiki pleaded guilty to his charges and immediately agreed to cooperate with the feds. DEA Special Agent J. Raji, out of Greenville, South Carolina, interviewed Kiki that very afternoon. There were a couple of things the government was eager to know, and one of them had to do with a man Raji had interrogated 2 years earlier, Kiki's co-defendant Ulysses Hackett. During the interrogation of Hack, Raji had been surprised to find that Hack was defending Kiki. Hack denied to the agent that Kiki had much of anything to do with the cocaine trade, and at that point, Raji cut the interview short. He didn't believe what he was hearing, and he didn't want to continue an interview with someone who was lying to protect another suspected drug dealer. Within months, Hack and his girlfriend, Misty Carter, were dead. 6 months after Hack met with Raji, he and Misty were gunned down in the middle of the night as they lay in bed. It appeared that someone thought that Hack said too much, and the DEA was left wondering if Hack had been intentionally silenced. Nearly 2 years later, as Raji began asking questions of Kiki, he felt he was interrogating one of the few witnesses who could offer any insight into the double homicide. But when Raji asked about Hack and Misty's deaths, Kiki said he had no idea who was behind the killings. He said he'd been scared when he heard about what happened. He pointed out that he was under house arrest at the time, and he said he immediately called his mother-in-law, Atlanta Mayor Shirley Franklin, upon hearing the news. He said she confirmed the killings through her police department. She then allowed Kiki to stay at her house for his own safety, he claimed. Less than 2 months later, he went on the run. Kiki told Agent Raji that while he was a fugitive, he didn't want to leave his wife, the mayor's daughter, destitute. So he funneled cash to her through his associate, Eric Mookie Rivera, who'd ferried Kiki's drugs and drug proceeds across the country in private jets. Kiki wanted to make sure Kai Franklin Graham had enough money to cover the couple's mortgage and bills. He also said that he never had any direct contact with her while he was on the run, which was consistent with what Kai herself had told authorities, though quite inconsistent with what others would say. Before Kiki was caught, his wife filed for both bankruptcy and divorce. In court documents, she claimed her husband had abandoned her. She claimed she was destitute and couldn't afford to pay the bond Kiki had broken, let alone her $5,000 monthly mortgage and her everyday expenses. The $80,000 salary she'd earned while working for her father at his airport concessions company had dried up too. David Franklin's business was failing, and he could no longer afford to pay his daughter. In fact, the company would declare bankruptcy and be shuttered a year later. Kai was making a successful case for bankruptcy protection. Court documents described her as subsisting off a $2,000 monthly handout from family and friends, having received no other contributions in the past 2 years. Shortly thereafter, Kiki's associate, Mookie, was arrested at the Van Nuys airport with a suitcase packed with cocaine. He eventually agreed to cooperate with investigators, several months before Kiki did. As a result, Kiki's revelation about funneling money to Kai didn't come as a surprise. Mookie had already told the agents about the deliveries. However, there was one part of the narrative where their stories didn't match up. Mookie described conversations Kiki had with his wife, letting her know the cash was coming. Yet Kiki insisted that Kai had no knowledge of what was going on. He told Agent Raji that not once during his 3 years of marriage did he tell Kai he earned nearly all of his cash from cocaine. If she knew about it, Kiki said during his interview, it's not because I told her. Raji would later testify that he was skeptical of Kiki's denial. It would have been a crime for Kai to harbor her fugitive husband. It also would have been illegal for her to pay her bills with known drug money. Regardless of what went on between the couple early in the marriage, Raji thought Kai would have a hard time claiming ignorance about the origin of the money that showed up on her doorstep. After all, by that time, her husband was a federal fugitive, wanted on major drug charges. Back in 2004, Agent Raji suspected that Hack was lying to protect his friend Kiki, a plan that appeared to have tragically backfired. Now Raji believed he was being fed another line of bullshit, and he would later testify that he believed Kiki was lying to protect his wife. In the end, Raji's interview with Kiki was far from revelatory. Even after Kiki was given a list of names and asked to divulge what he knew about each one, he didn't exactly elaborate. When Raji asked about Terry Flannery and Demetrius Flannery, Kiki said they were the leaders of BMF, but he didn't delve much further than that. It was the same deal when Raji brought up Jamad Soup Ali, the man who'd been spotted by an eyewitness leaving Misty Carter's townhouse the night she and Hack were killed. Again, Kiki was vague, and the feds reached the conclusion that Kiki was lying to protect Soup too. But Kiki did help the feds in one substantial way. He agreed to testify in the impending trial of his boss, Jerry J-Rock Davis. The following day, after learning about the recent development, J-Rock followed Kiki's lead and entered a guilty plea. Unlike Kiki, J-Rock wasn't interested in sharing info with the feds in exchange for a lighter sentence. The reason? J-Rock's lawyer claimed his client didn't want to expose his loved ones to retribution from his associates in the Black Mafia family. 6 weeks after the two pleas, Kiki sat down to a lie detector. The polygraph was a condition of his plea deal. Federal prosecutors expected full and truthful information from him, and they intended to make sure they got it. If they didn't, Kiki's guilty plea would still stick, but the feds would be allowed to withdraw their offer of a reduced sentence and push for the maximum. There were two things that the polygraphers planned to ask Kiki about, both of which Agent Raji already had gone over. First, they wanted to find out if he knew anything about the murders of Misty and Hack. They also wanted to know if he'd ever told his wife that his income came from the cocaine trade. During the polygraph, Kiki's interrogator asked several relevant questions. Did you shoot those people? Each of which were sandwiched between 10 non-relevant ones. What is your shoe size? That way, the test could determine whether he reacted differently to the controversial versus the non-controversial inquiries. His reaction was measured by any change in his breathing rate, heart rate, and sweat gland activity. Over and over, in the midst of all those mundane statements, the polygrapher would let slip the loaded questions. Did you shoot those people? Did you participate in shooting those people? Do you know for sure who shot those people? Did you tell your wife that any of the money came from drug proceeds? It took 6 hours to plow through the test. Each set of questions had to be repeated several times, and the questions themselves had to be asked slowly, with a 20-second pause between each one to give the machine ample time to gauge Kiki's reaction. His attorney peeked in on him several times, and he complained about how cold it was in the stark room. He said he hadn't eaten all day. His interrogator eventually bought him an apple. The experience was exhausting. After the test was over, the polygrapher gave Kiki a rough idea how he did. The results weren't final. They'd first have to be vetted by the DEA. But the polygrapher was able to draw a few broad conclusions. He said Kiki's reaction to the questions about the murder was positive, indicating that he was telling the truth. But the DEA later determined that the results were inconclusive. The questions were not asked in the proper sequence, the agency ruled. His reaction to the questions about Kai, on the other hand, showed he was being deceptive, the polygrapher said. The DEA would rubber stamp those results. After hearing the results, Kiki turned away from the table. His hands flew to his face several times. He laughed a tired laugh, and he told the polygrapher that the test was wrong. He repeated to him what he told Agent Raji, that he never ever let Kai know that his money came from the drug trade. 2 weeks after the polygraph, the holes in Kiki's story got a lot more pronounced. The U.S. Marshal Service finally fielded a tip as to where Kiki's close friend and business partner, Scott King, might be hiding out. Scott had been a fugitive for more than 2 years now. Somehow, when the feds caught Mookie, Kiki, and J-Rock in L.A. the year before, Scott managed to slip away. From then on, he remained a step or two ahead of the feds, even after a high-speed police chase during which he crashed his SUV and fled the scene by foot. But on June 6, 2006, the game was up. Investigators finally cornered Scott, who was hiding out at a friend's house in the LA suburbs. The marshals found him in the closet, under a pile of clothes. Within weeks, Scott agreed to tell investigators everything, and to tell it in great detail. Unlike Kiki's version of events, Scott's story made sense to the feds. It also was consistent with the information Mookie provided. Scott said that while Kiki was on the run, he spoke regularly to his wife. In fact, he had a special phone that received her calls, a phone Kiki referred to as the Kai phone. Scott also described an event that he and Kiki witnessed in D.C. in 2001. He said they were riding around in a limo with a bunch of friends when one of the guys, Jamad Soup Ali, shot a man dead in the street. Scott said Kiki clearly saw what happened, yet Kiki hadn't mentioned it during his debriefing. Nor did Kiki mention a man named Ernest Watkins, whom Scott described as an integral part of his and Kiki's drug ring. Scott said Ernest helped ship kilos of cocaine across the country using an inside source at the United Parcel Service. According to Scott, Ernest also played a crucial role in the murders of Misty and Hack, perhaps without knowing it. Ernest allegedly provided Kiki with the murder weapon, which Kiki in turn passed along to J-Rock. Yet when Kiki met with Agent Raji, he never so much as brought up Ernest's name. The feds didn't think that was an oversight. They thought Kiki was trying to protect Ernest for the same reason he might want to protect Soup. It was in his best interest to keep investigators in the dark about the details of Misty and Hack's deaths. Agent Raji, with the help of Agent Harvey, quickly tracked down Ernest in Atlanta. He had not yet been charged with a crime, but he was told he might be soon. As a precautionary measure, Ernest agreed to speak with the agents. He told them that Kiki was an acquaintance of his. He said he wouldn't call him a friend. When shown a photo of Kiki's confidant, Mookie, Ernest said he didn't recognize him. Mookie, on the other hand, had told investigators that he and Ernest had worked closely together. "Are you sure?" the agents prodded Ernest. "Yes," he said, "I'm sure." The agents then asked if Ernest, an admitted gun collector, ever had a weapon stolen. "No," he said. The agents then asked if he'd ever traded in a gun. "No," he replied. "Ever given one away?" "No." Finally, the agents asked Ernest if he was willing to take a polygraph test. He said he wasn't. A month later, Ernest was served with a subpoena to appear before a Greenville grand jury. At that point, some of his answers changed. Once under oath, Ernest said that he did know Mookie after all. He also said that in 2003, his home had been burglarized and 3 guns were stolen. Meanwhile, investigators continued to hunt for evidence against Kiki. Even though he'd already pleaded guilty, there was still a case to build. The prosecution wanted to convince the judge that Kiki had fed them lies when they bargained for the truth. By October 2006, the government had amassed 200 pages of new allegations, most of them raised by Scott King. The following day, Scott pleaded guilty to cocaine and money laundering charges. Also on that day, Greenville U.S. Attorney Reginald Lloyd sent a letter to Graham's attorneys. Kiki's guilty plea would stand, the letter stated, but the government's promise of a reduced sentence was null and void. Prosecutors would now aggressively pursue the maximum punishment, according to the letter. The United States intends to present evidence as to the defendant's involvement in various crimes and acts of violence, including but not limited to the brutal murder of Ulysses Hackett and Melissa Carter, in support of its request for a life sentence. On June 15, 2006, near the Upper East Side corner of 57th Street and Madison Avenue, federal agents slipped behind a pair of heavy-etched glass doors. Above the entryway, silver letters mounted against a white-tiled background spelled out, Jacob and Company. Unlike the last time the agents traveled to Manhattan to visit Jacob the jeweler Arabo, this time they arrived unannounced, and they were carrying a search warrant. The agents stepped into the brilliant space-agey showroom, moving purposefully across the glossy floor. Built-in jewelry cases glowed a purplish blue against gleaming white walls. The cases held chunky 60-carat pendants, glimmering chandelier earrings, a one-of-a-kind canary yellow diamond ring worth nearly $1 million, and in the roped-off VIP section, Jacob's signature diamond-encrusted 5 time-zone watches. The agents were on the hunt for documents pertaining to the Flannery brothers, and they had a search warrant that granted them better than VIP access to Jacob's surreal jewelry salon. After passing rows upon rows of bling, they headed to Jacob and Company's office, where they went straight for a file marked Damon Thomas. Damon, an LA music producer who'd worked with the likes of Justin Timberlake and Aretha Franklin, was an integral part of the Fed's investigation into the possibly criminal connection between Jacob the jeweler and the Black Mafia family. The previous summer, Damon had claimed to be the owner of most of a whopping $5 million in jewelry confiscated from Terry Flannery during a Missouri traffic stop. Jacob himself had claimed the 6 remaining pieces. It was part of a plan they'd hatched with Terry. It could never be known that the jewelry belonged to the cocaine kingpin. That would draw way too much attention. After claiming the jewelry, Jacob went so far as to tell the DEA that he'd never sold Terry Flannery a single diamond. To back up his claim, he produced a document showing that all the jewelry seized in the traffic stop either had been purchased outright by Damon Thomas or consigned to him. Even after Terry and Meech were indicted, Jacob continued to press the government for the return of the 6 pieces he supposedly lent Damon. On November 28, 2005, Jacob went so far as to send a letter to the U.S. Attorney's Office through his attorney that stated, "Please make arrangements to have the jewelry in question returned to my client as soon as possible." Attached to the letter was the fake document Jacob had created, purporting that the jewelry had been consigned to Damon. Basically, Jacob was delivering to the feds evidence that would later incriminate him. On June 13, 2006, 2 days before the DEA showed up at Jacob and Company with their search warrant, Jacob sent yet another letter, again through his attorney, to the government. "It has now been 7 months since my first telephone conversation with you concerning my client's jewelry that was seized by the government. My client is quite perplexed and frankly does not understand what he must do to get his jewelry returned." Little did Jacob know, Damon had already cooperated against him. Damon didn't give in easily. He'd been subpoenaed to testify about the jewelry before a federal grand jury in Detroit the month before. Through his attorney, he invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and attempted to keep his mouth shut. Feds then filed a compulsion order to force Damon to testify, and he relented. He described the plan hatched by him, Jacob, and Terry. The feds then took a trip to New York's Upper East Side. At Jacob and Company, DEA agents found in Damon's file a photo of Terry and his girlfriend, Tanessa. They also recovered receipts showing that jewelry had been shipped to 2 Atlanta addresses with ties to the Flannerys: 404 Motorsports, the business owned by Scott and Kiki, in which Terry Flannery was a silent partner, and the home of Yogi, Meech's assistant. A month later, in July 2006, 16 more people were added to the Flannery brothers' indictment. Jacob was among them. He faced 1 count of money laundering for allegedly circumventing the IRS so that the Flannerys could spend their drug money on his jewelry, and for lying to the feds about true owners of the bling. The indictment also nabbed Meech's second-in-command, J-Bo, Terry's right-hand man, Slim, his girlfriend's son, Marlon Lil Dog Welch, Meech and Terry's longtime associate, Wayne Joyner, the one who'd allegedly introduced them early on to their Mexican cocaine connection, Paul Buford, who was chief of security for Sean P. Diddy Combs, and most surprisingly, Meech and Terry's father, Charles Flannery. Meech believed the feds were trying to rattle him by charging his 58-year-old father, who'd never been in trouble with the law before. Charles's alleged crime: handing envelopes stuffed with Terry's cash to a contractor working on the White House. It didn't matter that neither the money nor the home belonged to Charles, and that he appeared not to benefit in any way from the transaction. The alleged act still constituted money laundering. Considering the insignificance of the allegation, Meech felt the government was targeting his father as a way to pressure him and his brother into pleading guilty. Perhaps if the brothers fessed up, the feds would spare Charles a trip to prison. But neither Meech nor Terry took the bait. Their father didn't want them to. As the brothers neared their 1-year anniversary of their indictment, each seemed determined to beat their charges, while faced with 2 very different sets of challenges. Terry's problems were more immediate. By the summer of 2006, his relationship with his Detroit-based attorney, Steve Fishman, had deteriorated. Terry requested that Fishman be removed from the case. He also claimed that he was destitute and therefore unable to retain a lawyer on his own. Terry asked that the court appoint him an attorney, and the judge obliged. The appointment of a public defender marked a precipitous fall for a man who was accustomed to driving Bentleys and Maybachs and dropping $50,000 on Lakers tickets. Meech, on the other hand, was doing his best to keep up appearances while behind bars. His well-respected legal team, Finling out of Atlanta and James Feinberg out of Detroit, worked aggressively to challenge the hundreds of motions filed by federal prosecutors and to investigate the government's voluminous evidence. In the meantime, Meech wanted everyone to know that his current situation wouldn't derail his dreams. From behind bars, Meech kept BMF's publicity machine humming. He even attempted to keep his year-old magazine, The Juice, afloat, despite having published only one issue the summer before. On his MySpace page, where well-wishers left comments that proclaimed BMF for life and Free Big Meech, the boss posted letters to his followers. One of them, dated August 30th, 2006, suggested that he'd be out soon, and that he expected those on the outside to behave accordingly. As you can see, they can lock up my body, but not my mind. So I just want everybody to know that this is the real Big Meech. MySpace website, and I appreciate everyone for logging on and sending your pictures, music, and comments. Everything gets forwarded to me in St. Clair County Jail, where I'm temporarily being held. The world is still BMF's. We still here, and we not going anywhere. Even though I'm locked up, I'm still focused on my vision, making my challenges temporary, but my vision permanent. So understand that nothing disturbs the trials of the present, like the expectations of the future. I will be back in black soon. So until my pencil meets my paper again, remember, loyalty is not just a word, it's a lifestyle. By the time Meech's MySpace letter was posted, Doc Marshall had been holed up in an Orlando jail cell for nearly a year. He'd been allowed out on several occasions to travel to no less than 3 states to assist authorities in their BMF investigations. He testified in front of grand juries in Atlanta and Detroit. He showed up in Greenville, South Carolina, to take the stand against Kiki and J-Rob, though he was relieved of having to testify after the duo entered last-minute guilty pleas. He met on numerous occasions with Detective Burns and Agent Harvey in Atlanta to help them identify specific members of BMF. And in early 2007, he agreed to sit down with another Atlanta lawman, one who toiled through the 3 BMF-related murder investigations in as many years. Despite a couple of promising leads, Atlanta homicide detective Mark Cooper had made no arrests in a string of brazen killings, a shootout that left 2 men dead behind Club Chaos, a vicious brawl that took the life of a man behind the Velvet Room, and the apparent revenge killing of a drug defendant and his girlfriend. But in one of those cases, Cooper was about to get the break he'd been waiting for. Near the end of 2006, the detective got a call from the DEA. Doc Marshall, who was under federal indictment in Florida, had information he was willing to share about a murder he'd witnessed. He wanted to come clean about what happened behind the Velvet Room. A month later, on January 15, 2007, Detective Cooper traveled to Orlando to interview Doc. The former CFO was at ease with the detective. They chatted comfortably. He filled Cooper in on some of the people who were part of Meech's entourage that night. He said Meech's right-hand man, J-Bo, was there, of course. So was Meech's close friend, the rapper Blue Da Vinci, and his third-in-command, Fleming Ill Daniels, who was jokingly referred to as Il Pesci, because his short stature and tough guy attitude brought to mind the actor Joe Pesci. Omari O-Dog McCree was part of the crew too, as were several other mid-level players, Baby Blue, Duran D-Shot Hall, Martez Tito Berth, and Amin Bull Height, just regular guys that we hang out with, Doc told Cooper. After asking Doc to describe where everybody was situated in the parking lot, Cooper got to the point. "Let me ask you this," he said. "Was the guy laying on the ground when he was shot?" "Yes," Doc said. "He certainly was." Cooper then asked Doc to slow down and start from the beginning. Ill was backing up his vehicle, and he didn't see the guys behind him, Doc recalled. So the guys started banging on the window. One of them said, "Hey, look, man, you about to run us over." So at that point, Ill was like, "Y'all motherfuckers don't ever touch my car again." By then, Doc said Meech and his bodyguard were gone. J-Bo was pulling out of the lot himself, and those who were left jumped into the fight. It starts out to be about 5-on-3, and they were beating the guys pretty decently, Doc said. One of them slips out and leaves. Then about 5 minutes later, you hear bang, bang, bang. He's just shooting up in the air, and everybody drops. Doc said that it was clear to everyone involved that one of the guys who was getting beat up had squeezed off a few warning shots. It wasn't a big deal, he claimed. The fight appeared to be winding down anyway. Then he said one of Meech's guys snapped. At that point, Il goes to the car. I seen his weapon when he pulled it out. Now the guy is already beat down good, so Il goes bang, bang, bang. Then he waited, and in another second, pow, he dropped the last one. So you actually saw him? Cooper asked. Yeah, Doc said. This is something where you hook me to a polygraph, and I'm right there with it. It's not no third party or no hearsay. You definitely didn't see the victim with a gun or anything? No, he was whooped up. It didn't make any sense. The guy was busted. I don't know if that was just a retaliatory thing that Il did. He was off the chain most of the time. A week later, Cooper obtained an arrest warrant for Fleming Il Daniels, charging him with the murder of Rashanabal Prince Drummond. Il already was jailed on a minor probation violation charge. As soon as he finished serving that time, he'd be transferred to another jail to deal with the far more serious accusation. Debbie Morgan had been waiting nearly 2 years for an arrest in the murder of her son. She'd been in regular contact with Detective Cooper and Special Agent Harvey. Early in the investigation, she tried to help investigators by convincing Prince's friends to tell police about what happened that night. She'd also rebuffed an offer sent to her through people she assumed were Meech's minions to handle this whole ordeal the street way. Instead, she sought out a distraction, something that might help her forget that there'd been no closure in Prince's case. She found a small space for rent inside a tattered shopping center just off Boulevard, along the gritty but hip stretch between the Atlanta neighborhoods Old Fourth Ward and Cabbagetown. She would open a Jamaican restaurant there, called One Love. But before the restaurant opened, Debbie's world fell apart again. Her eldest child, Rashim, was gunned down in broad daylight by 2 men on Martin Luther King Drive. At first, she thought Rashim's death was retaliation for the heat drawn to BMF over Prince's murder, but she was mistaken. The killings were unrelated. Nonetheless, Agent Harvey responded to the crime scene himself, just to be sure. Rashim's suspected killer was arrested the following day. It was a small consolation, but consolation nonetheless. Of course, Rashim's death was an excruciating reminder of the loss she'd already suffered. After the second of her 3 sons was killed, Debbie needed closure for Prince more than ever. Doc Marshall helped deliver that. After he agreed to talk to Detective Cooper, Debbie finally had a clearer picture of what happened that night, and she was relieved to know that the man believed to be her son's killer was finally locked up. From the beginning, she felt that the Black Mafia family was responsible for Prince's death. She'd been looking for validation for 3 years. In fact, her quest had started with a letter she wrote to the Atlanta mayor days after Prince was killed. Dear Mayor Shirley Franklin, on July 25th, at approximately 4 a.m. in the parking lot of the Velvet Room, my son Prince and my nephew were jumped on, stomped, and beaten by a group of men. Prince was shot and died in the parking lot. I believe the detectives involved will do a thorough job. However, this is a gang of drug dealers and murderers who have set up shop in most major cities. And make no mistake, business is booming. They traveled under the guise as a promotions and record company. Miss Franklin, I appeal to you not as my mayor, but as a mother who knows the pain of childbirth and would understand the loss of a son. You have seen your son grow to manhood, and your dreams of seeing your grandchildren may have already come through. My son died without a child. My dreams of seeing his seed grow has been shattered. These individuals drive around this city in luxury cars, doing what they please, living by the motto, "We rule the world." My question, Miss Mayor, is do they rule Atlanta? Within months of Il's arrest, another seemingly dormant murder investigation would be revived. And another mother who lost a child would be left wondering how, under the watchful eye of the government, such a terrible thing could happen. Nearly 3 years after Misty Carter's death, her townhouse on Atlanta's Highland Avenue was just as she'd left it. Katie Carter wanted it that way. To Katie, the mere thought of the townhouse was excruciating at times. She imagined the police trudging into the bedroom that had become a crime scene. She imagined the paramedics carrying Misty out. But the townhouse was also a source of solace. Katie kept it for as long as she did because, at other times, it helped convince her, if only for a second, that Misty was still there. Katie could visualize her daughter surrounded by all her things, breathing and laughing and alive. She didn't believe that she was crazy to think that. She believed she had to do what she could to keep going. Her only child, the joy of her and her husband's life, was gone. So it's okay to pretend. When she stopped pretending, Then she'd have to admit to herself that Misty was truly and forever gone. After Misty died, Katie began to work long hours at her husband's medical practice. The work took her mind away from things. At home, the pain was constant. Plus, being away from the house gave Katie another chance to make believe. She'd often call home from the office to check her answering machine. One of the messages would always be from Misty. It was the last message Katie got from her daughter. She couldn't bring herself to erase it. By the spring of 2007, 3 years had passed since that terrible night, and time had done little to ease the pain. But there was one small source of solace. In April of that year, Katie and her husband, Dr. Paul Carter, traveled from their home in Fayetteville, North Carolina, to a federal courthouse 4 hours away. They wanted to be sitting in the courtroom, and the judge read the prison sentences of Tremaine Kiki Graham, Scott King, and Eric Mookie Rivera. The hearing in Greenville, South Carolina would be unusual as far as sentencings go. Prosecutors were hoping to prove that Kiki had lied to the feds, thereby breaking his contract for a reduced sentence. To prove that he'd misled the government, his associates Scott and Mookie would be testifying against him. If the judge believed them, Kiki could be sentenced to life without parole on his cocaine charges. Still, there was a chance the judge wouldn't buy their stories, and Kiki was willing to gamble on that. The possibility of a life sentence hadn't been his only option. Even after he failed his polygraph, Kiki got one last offer from the government. The prosecution was willing to go as low as 35 years, 5 years less than the sentence his boss, J. Rock Davis, received. But Kiki turned the deal down. Despite the fact that prosecutors intended to bring up evidence of his alleged role in the murders of Misty and Hack, he was willing to risk it all. When Scott King took the stand on morning of April 17, 2007, he spared no detail. In front of a room full of onlookers, including the families of both Misty and Hack, he methodically laid out the history of his friendship and business relationship with Kiki. He described how the two met, back when Kiki was still a student at Clemson University. He talked about how they both fell into a local cocaine trade. He mentioned that Kiki helped him get back in the drug game after he finished a 3-year stint on a cocaine charge. By that time, Scott recalled, they both ended up in Atlanta. He said Kiki was clearly doing well for himself. Soon, he said, they combined forces. They found a big-time dope supplier in J-Rock. They opened a high-end car dealership to help their drug income seem legit. They each dated one of the mayor of Atlanta's daughters. They pulled their friends, including Ulysses Hackett, into their drug ring. Then the cocaine operation they so carefully pieced together began to crumble. Scott described his decision to flee to California after he learned he'd been indicted. He said Kiki, who would be added to the indictment a little later, decided to stick it out in Atlanta. Scott claimed that even then Kiki was suspicious about Hack. Did y'all discuss any particular concerns about Mr. Hackett? Assistant U.S. Attorney Mark Moore asked Scott. Yes, Tremaine told me he felt that Hack was cooperating and that we might need to take care of him. When you say take care of him, what did that mean to you? Kill him. And how did you feel about that, Mr. King? I didn't want no part of it. He was like my brother. But to Tremaine, he was just somebody who could finger him and get him convicted. Did you agree to assist Mr. Graham in doing something to Mr. Hackett? Moore continued. No, Scott said. Did Mr. Graham let it die at that point? No. What, if anything, did he say to you? That he was going to find somebody to take care of him. According to Scott, that person was J-Rock. Kiki had convinced the boss that Hack could incriminate him too. So if Jerry didn't want to get fingered in our indictment, Scott testified, maybe he needed to think about taking care of Hackett. Did you have any other discussions with Mr. Graham about doing something to Mr. Hackett? Moore asked. Yes. He discussed getting a gun from Ernest Watkins to take care of the murder. He told me that Ernest had come across a gun and gave it to him. And did he tell you what, if anything, he did with that gun? He told me he passed it along to Jerry Davis. Scott said Kiki was out on bond and under house arrest one morning several months later, and he was roused from sleep by a ringing phone. He said Kiki was on the line, and he had news to share. Stupid and the girl are dead. Within weeks, Kiki jumped bond and joined Scott in L.A., Scott recalled. During the time period that he was living as a fugitive in California with you, Moore continued, did y'all have any other further discussions about what happened to Ulysses Hackett and Misty Carter? Yes, Scott said. Tremaine told me that Jerry and him had went over to T's house. Who is T? Big T from BMF. Is that Terry Flannery? Yes. Did you know Mr. Flannery? Yes. And where did you meet him? In Atlanta, at my place of business. Why did you meet him in Atlanta at your place of business? 'Cause he invested in the business. So Tremaine told you about an occasion where he and Jerry Davis went over to Terry Flannery's house. Yes. And somehow Hack's name came up, and Jerry boasted that he had took care of it. Under cross-examination, Kiki's attorney hinted that Scott might be saying whatever he could to make sure he served the least possible sentence. You obviously don't want to spend any more time than you have to in prison, correct? The attorney J. Bradley Bennett asked. I'm saying, I've done the crime, so I'm going to do the time, Scott replied. Do you have a desire to spend less time in prison? Bennett reiterated. I have a desire to tell the truth, Scott shot back. After Scott wrapped up his lengthy testimony, U.S. District Court Judge Henry Herlong called a short break. When he returned to the bench, one of the prosecutors approached him with an alarming bit of information. She said the government's next witness, Eric Mookie Rivera, had just been threatened by Kiki. May it please the court, Your Honor, Prosecutor Reagan Pendleton interjected. Mr. Rivera, the government's witness and co-defendant in this case, was brought in the courtroom by marshal service and placed in the chair, at which time the court was in recess and everyone was standing around talking. And I glanced over and I observed Mr. Graham make a threatening gesture toward Mr. Rivera. He pointed his fingers as if shooting a gun, and then put the gun to his heart. Mr. Rivera observed it, and I observed it, and Mr. Rivera is very concerned about it. The judge said he would get to that in due time, but first, a somewhat shaken Mookie launched into his testimony. Like Scott King, he gave a sprawling narrative of the history of Kiki's friend and drug associate. Mookie described himself as a courier for hire who transported kilos of coke and huge shipments of cash across the country on private jets. He recalled meeting Kiki through their mutual employer, J-Rock. He said he continued to do business with Kiki while he was under house arrest, and that the two became friends. Mookie said Kiki opened up to him. Did you have a conversation with him about Ulysses Hackett's death? Prosecutor Moore asked. It came up, Mookie said. How did it come up? While I was over there, we were discussing our next trip, and out of curiosity, I asked him how the case was going. And he says, oh, it's looking good right now. I said, what's going on? He said the one guy that could say anything about him got murdered. He just said that guy is gone. He can't say anything about him. Mookie testified that after Kiki became a fugitive, he traveled to the East Coast to pick up drug money for him, and that while he was in Atlanta, Kiki had him deliver bundles of cash to his wife. Mookie said he also met with Kai Franklin Graham to pick up Kiki's son. He said he transported the child across the country so that Kiki could spend time with him. Mookie then returned the boy to Kai in Atlanta. At the end of his testimony, the judge asked Mookie to describe what had just happened between him and Kiki in the courtroom. He, made eye contact, and then he shot one time, Mookie said, pointing with two fingers the way children do when mimicking a gunshot. And what did you take that to mean? The judge asked. But you know, they're going to try to kill me. Later in the hearing, Mookie took the opportunity to address some of the people seated in the courtroom. I want to apologize for the loss that the Hackett family received and the Carter family. I hope that they do get justice. The judge then sentenced Mookie to 3.5 years in federal prison. As for Scott King, his situation was more serious. Scott was a higher-level dealer, one who'd spent 2 years as a federal fugitive. What's more, he brought his friend Hack into the fold, eventually leading him to his death, even if Scott didn't have a hand in the murder. After Mookie's testimony, the judge asked Scott if he had any more to say before his sentence was read. I would like to apologize to the Hackett family and the Carter family, and let them know that I love Misty and Hack like a brother and sister, he said. I'm just so sorry. Despite Scott's extensive cooperation, his punishment was severe. Judge Herlong gave him 24 years. Neither Mookie's nor Scott's sentence was all that unexpected. The real barometer of the government's success would be Kiki's prison term. Right away, the judge hinted that he was impressed with the evidence that the government laid out and with the broader investigation. I've handled some very serious drug cases, Furlong said. This is the biggest one I have ever seen. Then it was Kiki's turn to speak. He tried to strike a conciliatory tone, perhaps with a poor choice of analogies. I assure you, I have many, many regrets, he told the judge. And if I could take them back, I would in a heartbeat. But unfortunately, life is not like golf. So you can't take a mullet. He too asked for mercy and forgiveness. He also tried to diminish the testimonies of Scott and Mookie. I learned that as long as you've got life, you have a chance to turn your life around, Your Honor, Kiki said. That's what I've been trying to do. And I feel I've been truthful, Your Honor. And I'm sorry that my story wasn't embellished or sensationalized enough to the agent's liking. But my plea agreement didn't require that. All it required was for me to be truthful, Your Honor. And I was truthful. Last of all, he denied ever threatening anyone tied to the case, let alone wanting them dead. I just wanted on the record that there was no way I would threaten a witness or anyone in a courtroom, Kiki said. I mean, it just don't make sense. And for the record, me and Rivera was very close. Actually, it broke my heart to see him get on the stand and testify against me, Your Honor, because I have never did anything wrong to Rivera. I wouldn't want him dead or anyone dead. And I played no part in Misty Carter or Ulysses Hackett's murder. That's all I want to say. It was seen based on what happened next, that the judge was not moved to sympathy. I'm familiar with life sentences that have been imposed in this district, Judge Furlong said. And there certainly have been life sentences imposed for crimes of this nature and less than this nature. And as far as being compared to other major drug dealers, he ranks right up there at the top. It is therefore the sentence of the court that the defendant, Tremaine K. Graham, is hereby committed to the custody of the Bureau of Prisons to be imprisoned for a term of life. If Kiki wasn't officially a suspect in the murders of Misty and Hack before he was sentenced on cocaine charges, his status became official afterwards. But prosecutors still had a long way to go before they'd be ready to indict him for the killings, if they were ever to make such a move. By the summer of 2009, no charges had been filed in the 5-year-old double homicide. Still, in the year and a half following Scott and Mookie's testimony, the government began lining up several potential witnesses. The idea, as with the Detroit-based case against the Flannery brothers, was to bring charges against potential witnesses, then offer them plea deals in exchange for their cooperation. And there were two witnesses in particular whom federal prosecutors were eyeing. On the surface, it might have seemed pointless to investigate Kiki on a murder charge when he'd just been sentenced to life in federal prison. But in addition to holding someone accountable for the deaths, there was another reason the government might be inclined to prosecute. Killing a federal witness is a capital offense. Even before the feds tracked down the two witnesses they've been circling, one person central to the investigation already had landed in federal custody, Jamad Soup Ali. Soup had been snared in a sting operation at an upscale home in New Jersey suburb. He almost escaped through the window of a huge modern house, but a team of agents quickly surrounded the property. After storming the house, task force agents found a loaded machine gun in the closet of the master bedroom. As a result, Soup was charged with felony firearm possession. 2 months after Kiki's sentencing, Soup was sentenced to nearly 7 years in prison, giving the feds plenty of time to focus on the double homicide investigation without having to worry that the suspected hitman would slip away. With Soup behind bars, investigators turned their attention to the man who was believed to have supplied the murder weapon, Ernest Watkins. At first, Ernest had been hesitant to cooperate with the feds. He was cagey in his initial interviews, and the investigators believed that when he was called to testify in front of a grand jury, he misled jurors too. Scott King had an explanation for Ernest's behavior. He said Ernest had been kidnapped and tortured by drug-dealing acquaintances of Kiki, and that Ernest had the scars to prove it. In the fall of 2007, Ernest was indicted for cocaine trafficking, obstruction, and giving false statements to a grand jury. Months later, the government hired a specialist to examine the scarring on his back, which he claimed was the result of a motorcycle accident. On the second day of his trial in federal court, he cut the testimony short and entered a belated guilty plea. He signed an agreement to cooperate with the government. He later received the same sentence that Scott King did, 24 years. By then, the feds had another potential witness in the bag. In December 2007, Kai Franklin Graham struck a deal with the government and agreed to plead guilty to structuring financial payments. The feds decided not to seek more serious charge of money laundering. Her crime? Visiting 7 post offices and buying 14 postal money orders, totaling $1,000 each. She admitted that she bought the money orders in smaller increments to avoid drawing the attention of the IRS. The government had collected additional evidence that showed Kai Franklin Graham had been handling lots of cash. The feds claimed to have tracked down not just those 14, but 60 money orders that she bought while her husband was on the run. The prosecutor alleged that she used the money orders, all of which were just shy of $3,000 minimum that draws the IRS's attention, to pay her credit card bills and mortgage. It appeared to investigators that Kai wanted to keep the government from finding out where that cash was coming from. However, Kai denied that the money came from Kiki, or that she was trying to evade the IRS in order to throw the feds off her then-husband's trail. She claimed the money came from her father. That also had been her defense when the bonding company that sprang Kiki free at last sued her. The company accused Kai of misleading the government about both her financial situation and the whereabouts of her husband. Free at last was still hoping to recover $185,000 it had lost, a debt that Kai, who'd filed for bankruptcy, was trying to avoid. In a signed affidavit, Kai repeated her claims that she'd had no contact with Kiki after he fled, and that he'd left her destitute. Kai eventually prevailed in the lawsuit. Free at last settled the case for a paltry $5,000. At her plea hearing, held in the same courtroom where her ex-husband received a life sentence 8 months earlier, Assistant U.S. Attorney Moore contradicted her affidavit. The government could show, if required to a trial, that she assisted her husband in structuring other transactions on other dates, and that on a couple of occasions she received drug money from her husband's associates while he was fleeing. The government recommended that Kai serve 30 months of probation in exchange for her full cooperation in the U.S. Attorney's ongoing investigation. After Kai entered her plea and returned to her seat, her mother greeted her with a warm smile. Atlanta Mayor Shirley Franklin had traveled to South Carolina as a testament of her love and support for her daughter. She was a protective mother, and she was incensed that the case would later see a flurry of media attention. The scrutiny placed on the Franklin family was more than its matriarch was willing to endure. Months later, in an interview with National Public Radio, Franklin said that the publicity surrounding her daughter had turned her off to politics altogether. When you run for public life, you fully expect your own life to be evaluated, the mayor said during the interview. I did not expect that my children's lives would make the front page or NPR, and I'm not sure I would have run if I had known that. The truth of the matter is, I won't run again for that reason. I will not put my children, my grandchildren, or any of my family members in the spotlight again. The public can decide whether that's good or bad. It's great for me. Yet it wasn't Kai's case, or the break in the 3-year-old investigation into Hack and Misty's murders that got the lion's share of public attention in 2007. Instead, the fallout from the death of a 92-year-old woman named Katherine Johnston mesmerized Atlanta that year. The case brought much criticism to Franklin's administration and the Atlanta Police Department, and drove a wedge between 2 local law enforcement agents who'd once been consumed by the investigation of the Black Mafia family. The bond that the lawmen had enjoyed while working on the BMF case was destroyed by what happened in the Johnston one. When 3 Atlanta police officers showed up at Johnston's house on the fringe of the open-air drug zone called The Bluff, they believed they were serving a no-knock warrant on a drug dealer. The problem was, they'd lied to obtain the warrant. And it turned out that by cutting corners, they were targeting the home of an elderly woman who had nothing to do with the drug trade. 2 of the officers, Greg Jr. and Jason Smith, pried open Johnston's burglary bars and took a ram to her front door. Johnston heard them trying to break in. Scared for her life in the sketchy neighborhood, she grabbed her rusty revolver. As the officers barged in, she fired and missed. Jr. and Smith returned fire, squeezing off 39 rounds and striking her a half-dozen times. She was cuffed and left to die in her front hallway. Minutes later, Jr. and Smith realized that there were no drugs or drug dealers in the house. One of the officers tried to cover up their mistake by planting a few baggies of weed in the basement, but in the days to come, Officer Jr. caved. He told the FBI the whole story of the ill-fated day, from cutting corners on the warrant to planting drugs to cover up the killing of an innocent woman. That wasn't all. Jr. also described the allegedly unethical and illegal practices he'd witnessed at the Atlanta Police Department. He said that officers routinely lied under oath to obtain warrants, and that supervisors turned a blind eye to the practice so long as officers hit their arrest numbers. Junior shifted the blame away from his own actions and toward a more pervasive climate of corruption. He did so in order to serve the least possible sentence, and to represent him in his plea deal with the feds, he hired a tough former prosecutor and longtime friend to many of the officers who staffed the APD's now disgraced narcotics unit, a guy who'd always bonded more easily with cops than with his fellow lawyers. He hired Rand Shahey. The same month that Kiki was sentenced to life in prison, Junior, with Shahey at his side, pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. The fallen cop didn't wish to address the court, so Shahey spoke for him. He ripped into the police department, blaming the top brass for the corruption that had trickled to the rank and file. "It's a case where the fish rotted from the head down," Shahey told the judge. "Hopefully, this will reverberate through the police department." The plea did reverberate, in more ways than he anticipated. The officers with whom he'd worked so closely now considered him an outsider. His close friend, Detective Bryant Bubba Burns, who served as Shahey's best man when he married his third wife, a gutsy fellow prosecutor, the year before, was stunned by the position Shahey had taken. In some ways, it wasn't all that different from Junior's decision to turn against his former cohorts, or for that matter, Doc Marshall's, or Scott King's, or Mookie Rivera's. Tradition was tradition. Honor was honor. Rules were rules. Shahey, like the others, had broken the code.